Today we're looking at the Inca Empire, which was located in the western portion of South America. We're going to start a little bit with geography here. There's a couple of important maps I'd like to show you. Obviously, we're talking about the modern day areas of Peru with the capital city of Cusco, right along the Andes mountain range. And so if you take a look here, you're talking about a pretty narrow strip of land that extends down here through Peru, down into Chile. The red outline is sort of the region in which, of course, the Inca Empire extended to. And then you can see that the Andes mountain range, highly elevated here, kind of run right down the center of the Inca Empire. So some cultural foundations, some reasons that led to the Inca becoming a civilized empire in this region. They come from the Chavín, the Moche, the Nazca. These are the ancient groups that inhabited that region in Peru. The Wari, the Tiwanaku, and the Chimu also were in between those ancient civilizations and led up into the Inca. The Inca would eventually create the most powerful empire, extending their rule over the entire Andean region there. Talk about some of the origins of the Inca. They settled on very fertile lands in the valley of Cusco. Not all of the lands are inhabitable in the Andes Mountains, so they had to sort of center themselves in areas that they could grow crops. By the 1200s, though, the Inca had established a true civilization. They believed that their ruler was rather a descendant of their sun god, Inti, and so, of course, they had a little bit of what we could call theocracy in their form of rule there. Pachacuti is one of the earliest emperors in the Inca world, and we'll talk about him here at first. He was powerful, rather ambitious. He took the Incan throne in the year 1438. One of the things he's most well known for is conquering all of Peru. Obviously, we know that the Inca were centered in Peru, but Pachacuti sort of uses both military and diplomacy to take over the rest of the Peruvian land. By 1500, the Inca ruled a stretch of land that was about 2,500 miles along the western coast of South America, which is where I showed you on that map. They had 80 provinces and about 16 million people within the empire. They generally referred to their land as the empire or land of four quarters. So they did divide it up into different regional groups. This empire was created, as I said earlier, through a combination of diplomacy, yet also military force. They had a powerful military, but their goal was to really only use it when necessary. They had clever diplomats. What they would do is they would offer their opponents an honorable surrender. In exchange for loyalty, the Inca would then allow them to keep their own customs and rulers. This is a tactic that we've seen going all the way back to Cyrus the Great of Persia, Alexander the Great of the Macedonian Empire. So this is something that seems to work for the people that are being conquered in a reasonable fashion. Now, once an area was conquered, they would make every effort to gain the loyalty of the people and welcome the people into the Incan system. Roman numeral II focuses on Incan government and this idea of unity. They had governmental units. They were controlled by a central bureaucracy. And now a bureaucracy is a system of departments and agencies that are formed to carry out the work of government. For example, we have the Department of Transportation, Department of Trade, the Department of so on and so forth. You can put an X there. And really, these are ways that bureaucratic forms help to govern. Now, they had extensive economic and road systems. The Inca were great road builders, and they used this to support trade. They did have an official language of the empire. It's called Quechua, and they had schools set up to teach Incan ways of living. We're going to take a look at what it might be like to live in an Incan city. To emphasize control, one of the things that the Inca did was they built cities in areas that they had conquered, and their architecture remained the same. Every Incan city that you went to, the architecture was generally the same, and so you knew that it was constructed by the Incan government. Now, they are well known as master stone workers and engineers. They did not have iron tools, and they did not use the wheel. This makes their work even more impressive. The Inca built walls made out of perfectly fit blocks of stone. They did not use mortar, so the fact that they were able to cut and carve these stones into these perfect shapes is extremely impressive. I want to show you here in a second some of what Incan cities may have looked like. So here you'll see the city of Machu Picchu. Machu Picchu is sort of a special city because it's way up high in the mountains, and you can see how intricately designed some of these structures were and the excellent level of stonework and masonry work that the Inca show. Here you see ruins that are very old, close to 1,000 years old, and they're still standing in pretty strong structure here. Okay, government. A couple more things about how they used government and diplomacy to bring people together. They were very controlling and they were involved in the personal lives of their citizens and inhabitants. Some of the ways that they did this would be called the Allyu. The Allyu was an extended family group that would work together on public works projects like creating irrigation systems, creating step terrace farming, help to store food for each other in case of emergencies. They had a specific chain of command. They divided families into Alus of 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, so on and so forth. The general framework went from the community, small community, to the regional, okay, to Cusco, the capital. That was kind of the chain of command right there. They also had a system called the Mita. The Mita was actually a forced labor tribute system that was a requirement of all able-bodied citizens. You had to work for the state a certain number of days of every year. And then they also had something known as the welfare system. People were expected to work, and then eventually they would be cared for in return. Public works project that the Allyu and the Mita system would devote itself to would be the Incan road system. They had 14,000 miles of networks and roads and bridges that spanned through the entire empire. These roads would go over and through the rugged mountains and harsh deserts as well. They would have paved roads, and then they'd also have some that were just simple paths of crushed stones or dirt. They often had guest homes for travelers, which are kind of like what we think of as motels today. So even though the government was very controlling, they had some special situations where they really were able to help people. They had the Chasqui, which were messengers / runners that carried messages from area to communicate. And the roads also provided easy and efficient transportation of military troops. That's one of the big keys of having them. This sounds really close to the system of the Persians with the royal road. They even had some similar messengers that would run messages back and forth. So when you compare the Inca, I think a good comparison is to the Persian Empire, especially under Cyrus the Great, the benevolent ruler there. They did have record keeping. They didn't have a written system of writing, but they had oral tradition. They would pass down stories of history. And then they did have a quipu. A quipu is a set of knotted strings that could be used to record data. It was really an accounting system. And they also had a calendar system, which they would relate to their gods, sort of like what the Aztec and the Maya would do. This is an example of an Incan quipu. So it's a string, and then it has colored strings or dyed colored strings that would account for different methods of counting. And so you might have let's say the red string might be for population of a city, or the green might stand for storage of grain. Each knot on the string would stand for a certain interval. Like, let's just say it stands for 100 or 10 or 20. Each knot would then allow you to keep record of certain factions and groups or certain accountability within a city, state, empire, so on and so forth. So this is one of their major forms of record keeping in the Inca Empire. All right, we'll take a look at religion here next. Some of the practices include worshiping multiple gods, but fewer gods than the Aztecs in relationship. They did believe in nature spirits. Animism was very popular in most native societies of both northern, central, and southern America. They did have sun worship services. They had some groups called the Mamacuna, which are virgins of the sun. These are women that were trained in religious activities, teaching, spinning, weaving of cloth. And then they had a male version of this called the Yamakuna. These are young men that served the state in the same possible ways there. They did not sacrifice humans, but they often did sacrifice llama and other animals. Some humans were mummified in this region. So mummification was something that the Inca, the Nazca, and Moche also did. Cities, some of the major cities, Cusco was the capital city. Machu Picchu, as we saw earlier, was one that's famous because it's really well intact. Talk about the Inca decline. During the glory period, or the golden age of the Inca, was during the 1500s. You had Huayna Capac, who was a ruler. He died in the 1520s. And when he dies, he has two sons that kind of fought over the entire empire. They were Atahualpa and Huascar. They eventually get into a civil war. The war is won by Atahualpa, which gave him sole rule of the entire empire. But the civil war had weakened the empire severely. And then this is right at the same time, 1531, when the Inca were invaded by the Spanish. This is when Francisco Pizarro shows up with about 150 to 200 Spanish soldiers, and then from there, they are eventually conquered by the Spanish. And we'll learn about how that kind of goes down in chapter 20. Thank you.